Good morning. On behalf of OCP, I want to welcome you to License to Sing, Navigating the World of Copyright. For those of you who are not familiar with the GoToMeeting platform, you are encouraged to close out of other applications that might distract your internet connection. Also, in that box on the right-hand side of your screen, you are able to submit questions. The OCP team will be monitoring these questions throughout our session today. We will try to answer as many of those questions as time allows. Otherwise, a representative from OCP will follow up with you after the event. So let's get started. A little bit about me. My name is Paul Raspa. I am the General Manager of Licensing Online. And I've spent the past 22 years of my career connecting ministry and technology with a specific emphasis on electronic intellectual property for these last few years. I've worked in Catholic parishes. I've worked with many dioceses and archdiocesan initiatives, particularly in the areas of catechesis, pastoral life, and technology. And I've worked with national faith-based organizations as well. It's my pleasure to be with you this morning. An important disclaimer before we go too far. I am not an attorney, and so this morning's webinar is not intended to provide you with legal advice. If you have specific legal questions about copyright compliance and copyright laws, I would encourage you to consult with an attorney specializing in intellectual property. Today's session is really about information and education, and I think that you will find it quite valuable. So our webinar is only about 30 minutes today, and so we're going to move at a pretty brisk pace. We're going to talk about what intellectual property is, what copyrights are, what are permissions, and then I'm going to move into 5 tips to help you stay compliant with copyright laws. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about music reproduction licenses. So intellectual property is really the root of copyright. So what is that intellectual property? It's the non-tangible, non-physical things that are created in our minds. It's things like ideas and processes, words or lyrics, music, art, images and symbols, even brand names are intellectual property. These creations are really treasures, and I'd hope that you would think of them in that manner. They're really a treasure. They're property just like a gold ring or a car would be in our physical world. And I'm going to keep coming back to that gold ring and that car throughout our presentation this morning. Thinking more specifically about music intellectual property, we're talking about the tune, the melody, if you will. We're talking about arrangements and harmonizations, the words or the lyrics that are part of that song, any translations that may occur into other languages, as well as the engraving or any visual representation of the song. All of that is kind of bundled up together into intellectual property, and all of that is that treasure that a composer or an author is looking at. So what is this copyright thing? It's how we protect those intellectual treasures. It's this copyright notion. It's a legal protection that we have granted, that the law has granted to copyright owners. It allows the copyright owner, normally the publisher or the composer or the author, to stay in control of that treasure that they've created. In the United States, it's governed by the Copyright Act of 1909, which is also known as Title 17 of the United States Code. There's also a whole bunch of international copyright laws, some that govern across nations and across borders and involve a whole bunch of treaties, others which are specific to individual countries. Collectively, we as musicians, as ministers, as liturgists, as teachers, we have to comply with all those rules and all those laws when we're talking about copyright. So permission occurs when a copyright holder allows another party, like you or me, to handle their intellectual property. To draw the analogy, permission is what allows you to look at or to touch or to borrow my gold ring or my car. The treasure is still mine, but I'm allowing you the opportunity to engage with it in some manner. For music, permission is needed for reproducing or copying, for adaptation of a song in any way, including transposition, for distribution, for any type of public performance, and for any type of digital performance that might occur. You need permission for all of those things. Here's one of my favorite slides. Moses shared with us a wonderful commandment: you shall not steal. No, you may not steal my gold ring. No, you may not steal my car. And no, you may not steal my music or other intellectual property. Whenever you do something with intellectual property and you don't have permission or rights to do so, you're stealing, plain and simple. Copyright compliance is not rocket science. People ask me all the time, this is such a complex, complicated topic. How can you figure it all out? It's not rocket science, but there are many gray areas and many edge cases which make it a bit tricky. People get caught up in those edge cases, and that's really what confuses them. So this morning, I'm going to share with you 5 tips for helping you, your church, and your school remain in compliance. Tip number 1, always attribute. You got to make it clear that the song or the text or the image that you are using is not yours. It's somebody else's treasure. It's somebody else's property. It is important that you take the time and the energy to call that out. Put the name of the composer or the author next to the work that you have there, the song or the recording or any printed copies. Put the title of the book or the album that it came from. Identify the publisher. If you can, put the copyright line next to it. You do all of this so that there's no confusion that you're not claiming something to be yours that's not yours. You're not plagiarizing. You are simply acknowledging that this piece of work belongs to somebody else. And so you always want to attribute who it came from and who it really does belong to. Tip number 2. Some national copyright laws include a provision that's called fair use or fair dealings. And this particular clause or provision is really intended for academic and critical review of a work. So we're talking about academic settings that are using it to evaluate a song, evaluate the literary value of a text, things of that nature. It is not intended to grant you the right to copy or to perform music for worship or prayer or concerts or general education in the classroom. The scope is very narrow of what fair use is. A lot of people tend to hang on to certain phrases that are in the law that talk about religious exemptions or educational exemptions. I would encourage you to not hang on to those lines, because in most cases, when you read them in the context of the law, you find out that where they've used a single phrase, a religious exemption, what they're talking about is a very, very, very minute situation and not the broad sense that most of us tend to jump to. Another portion of the law talks about using an insignificant portion of the work in a manner that is inconsequential to your document or to your performance. The terms substantial and significance are very subjective and are largely at the discretion of the copyright holder. So, for instance, just printing a refrain might seem small and harmless to you, but the composer might claim that this refrain is really the essence of the entire song. Going back to my earlier analogy, you might claim that the steering wheel on a car is insignificant. It only weighs a few pounds. It's just one of nearly 2,000 parts on a typical car. However, the car manufacturer may beg to differ, stating that without the steering wheel, you really don't have a car. The whole point here is that it's subjective. What is substantial is subjective, and you don't want to be caught in a trap of a publisher or a copyright holder coming back and saying what you used was substantial, even though you may have perceived it otherwise. Our third tip: don't assume public domain. An old car doesn't necessarily mean that it's a classic. An old gold ring doesn't necessarily mean that it's a family heirloom. An old or traditional or a popular song doesn't necessarily mean that it's in the public domain. If you're not familiar with the term public domain, we are talking about songs that are not restricted by copyright and do not require a license or a fee for their use. Songs typically enter the public domain because their creator abdicated their rights when the song was first created, or the copyright has expired based on the standards in the country where the copyright was initially established. For most songs written in the United States, copyright protection is extended to the composer for their entire lifetime, plus an additional 70 years after that. That's a long period of time. My suggestion is that you assume that a song is under copyright unless you have proof that it is in the public domain. As a side note, a lot of other liturgical materials, such as lectionary texts, almost all scriptures, and most prayers out there are not in the public domain. They have specific organizations and ministries that own the copyrights. They are copyright holders. They own that treasure. So don't assume that things are in the public domain, especially based on side comments from friends and other colleagues who may say it is. Get proof for yourself. Tip number 4, limit sharing and copying. Anytime you copy or share a copyrighted song or text, you're committing piracy. Not to mention that you're breaking national and in some cases international laws. Typically, when you purchase a songbook, a piece of sheet music, a CD, an MP3, you're purchasing the rights for one individual, that's you, to use that material. If you need to share it with 5 people, then you need to purchase 5 copies. The exception would be if you have a license that grants you specific permission to make 5 copies. If you put the same file on your personal computer and your personal tablet and your personal smartphone, you are generally okay. As soon as it passes to someone else, you're likely out of compliance. You have to be mindful of this notion of public distribution, specifically public distribution of audio, videos, and sheet music. A lot of times we think of things as being private or very limited when the law and general publishing norms, copyright norms, would consider something public. Things like posting lyrics or posting an audio file onto your blog, it's public distribution. Posting to the choir page on your church website, that's public distribution. Posting to your private Facebook group just for your music ministry members on Facebook, public distribution. Attaching a file to an email, such as an MP3 or a PDF or an image, that's all public distribution as well, even though you might not think of it that way. Public distribution is not permitted unless you have explicit permission from the copyright holder to share those files, to share that information, to share that treasure with someone else. And finally, tip number 5, obtain permission. This is not one of those cases where it's okay to break the rules and ask for forgiveness later. The law is on the copyright holder's side, not yours. The penalties are real, and the penalties can be stiff. The fines can easily run into the thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's happened where churches, where dioceses, where large faith-based organizations have been slapped with fines. This is not new territory for publishers and copyright holders. You don't want to be the one that's trying to explain the reason for a lawsuit to your pastor or principal or to your bishop. So obtain the necessary permission up front and then use the song according to the rights that they have provided for you. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about licenses. I mentioned those a couple times during the tips. I want to keep playing with the analogy for a moment from earlier. It's kind of like you need a driver's license in order to operate a car. It grants you certain permission to be able to operate the vehicle on public roads in a certain manner for a certain period of time. When we're talking about intellectual property licenses, they are granted by the copyright holder and they give you certain rights. Those rights that they grant you, they could be broad. They could say you can do whatever you want with this song for the next 5 years, use it any way you want, share it any way you want, publish it, change it, do whatever you want with it. That's pretty rare. More often than not, when they grant you a license, it is very specific. For instance, you can use this song in printed fashion in this particular arrangement for this period of time. Or you can make very specifically 23 copies of this song for use in this particular church for this period of time. The details matter on this sort of issue. Whenever you're talking about a license, you want to be getting written permission, and that's really so that if the copyright holder comes back at a later date and tries to challenge the fact that you had permission, you have proof that they said that you could use it in this way for this period of time. So I would always encourage you to get your licenses in writing. I guess in this modern day and age, emails would suffice, but make sure you have it in a written format. The last part of this is a fee. License fees vary greatly. In some cases, it's pennies in order to get a license and to make copies or to use a song in a certain way. If you use it in other ways, the fees may be more substantial. And if you use it in commercial ways, for instance, using it in a book that you're selling or in a video that you're selling or in a production that you're doing, it could be in the thousands of dollars. It really just depends on what your use is. For most of what churches and schools do, the fees are pretty minimal by comparison. And those fees go to pay for the creation of new songs. It compensates in a very just way those publishers, those composers, those authors, those creators, so that they can then in turn feed their families and create more great content for us to use. In the Christian church and the school world, there's a common type of license known as a music reproduction permission, or sometimes known as a music reprint permission. These licenses typically cover the music that is used by the assembly or the congregation, and only that. That would be things like a notated melody line with text, or just simply the lyrics. These licenses, these music reproduction licenses as they're known in the industry, generally do not cover the music that is used by instrumentalists or by the choir. So why would you need one of these reproduction licenses? If you create worship aids in any fashion at any time in the year, you need to have permission to do that. Most parishes end up creating a worship aid for things like First Communion and confirmation, for funerals, for weddings. They may make a special booklet or an extended worship aid for Holy Week or for Christmas. You might make a worship aid for a prayer service or a penance service or some other sort of day of reflection. Or when you go on retreats, you might create worship aids and copies then. You need permission in order to make those copies. In some of our churches, and certainly in a lot of classrooms, we use projection. We project the lyrics or the melody lines up on a screen using PowerPoint or Keynote or some other software package. You need to have permission to do that, and a music reproduction license does that. The other area is that some parishes will include something in their bulletin or in some take-home study materials where they might quote a song or print the lyrics to a song. You want to make sure that you have permission for that as well. There are several agencies out there that offer these music reproduction licenses, but I want to focus on one that's near and dear to me, and that's known as licensing online. Licensing online brings together music from more than 250 publishers, including OCP. There are a variety of options in our license programs, and the pricing on those is based on the size of your church or school. So smaller churches pay less, larger churches pay more. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a couple minutes in terms of how you might obtain a license and how to go from there. But first, Summer from OCP has been tracking your questions throughout our webinar here. We have just a few minutes to get through some of those questions, and so we're going to try to answer a couple of those now.
Yeah, so I have a couple. First one, a music director has a question about making copies from their music resource and sending them home with musicians. Could you expand on the rules for this?
So in some cases, your church might have copies of a book or a missal or something of that nature that you use, that you own. And you want to make copies of those for convenience sake. If it's for convenience, most publishers, including OCP, grant you the permission to make a copy out of convenience for rehearsal purposes to take it with you. So rather than carrying your choral praise book with you, you can simply copy those 2 or 3 pages and take them back home, work on them, and then bring it back next week. The key is you can only make as many copies as books you've purchased. So if you only own 5 books, but you need to make 10 copies, that's a violation of the copyright. So it's merely out of convenience. It is not a matter of replacing or increasing the number of copies that are actually in circulation.
Awesome. Second question, why can't purchased Respond and Acclaim books be reused 3 years later?
So some books out there, calendars, Respond and Acclaim, missals, ordos, other books, the publisher has instituted a time limit on the permission that they've granted you for using that book in public performance, in using it for public worship, and using it in any manner. And there's fine print normally in the inside of or back covers of those books that simply state this book may be used for this period of time. If we go back to the beginning of the presentation when I was talking about what rights are out there and what rights can be granted by a copyright holder, time is one of those rights, and they can state, it's their discretion to say, you can only use it for this period of time. So if you pull out that Respond and Acclaim or that missal from 3 years ago and use it over, yes, some of the content may be similar, but yes, you are in violation of copyright.
Thank you. Third question, if I've paid for music, can a musician play it a little differently than what is printed?
I hear this question a lot. There are some pieces of the law, and there's some pieces and rights granted to you for artistic performance. So as you are playing an instrument, as you are singing a song, you have the option to variate from the printed score. You can improvise, you can add in extra notes, you can sing it an octave higher if you'd like. That's at your choice. Where you run into trouble is if you write it down, you violate copyright. So the key here is you cannot decide that you're going to simply transpose a song to another key, write it all out, photocopy it, and give it to your choir members or give it to your pianist. You cannot simply write in a new part or change the words and write it down and distribute it in any way. It's got to be entirely in the moment and not written. As soon as it's written or recorded, you're violating copyright.
Awesome. Okay, and this will be the last question. If I've purchased an accompaniment, or if I've bought accompaniment music but not the books for the parishioners, do you need to report the copies you make for them?
So the question is, if you buy one part of a musical arrangement but you don't own the other parts, do you have to tell somebody? The answer is you need to get permission before you make the copies for someone else. So in other words, this: if you have only purchased something that is for your choir or your music ensemble, and there is some sort of assembly part, or you want to print the lyrics for the assembly, not only do you have to get permission in order to make those copies or to present that to the assembly, but yes, you do have to report or tell that publisher that you used it and how many copies you made, and then also pay any associated licensing fees that come with that. If you have something like a music reprint license, typically those licenses cover large numbers of songs, tens of thousands of songs. And what you then do is follow up and say, I used song X 25 times and I used song Y 5 times. And that's how they then divide up your license fees and make it fair and just for all.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And we'll answer the rest of the questions in a follow-up email.
Great. So OCP has asked me to do just a slight plug here for the next webinar that they are hosting, which is on selecting music for contemporary liturgy. It will be held on November 20th, and the presenters will be Curtis Stephen and Lori Krupp, and I think that you will enjoy that presentation. So just to close out this morning, for more information on music reproduction licenses for your church or school, we would encourage you to contact OCP at the phone number and the email address listed here. As Summer mentioned, if we did not answer your question that you sent in during the webinar, a representative from OCP will be following up with you soon. Also, please take a moment to complete the survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. OCP greatly values your feedback and would like to improve their future webinars. Finally, a video of this webinar will be posted on the OCP website and on YouTube within the next few days. Please encourage others to view it as well. And on behalf of OCP and Licensing Online, I thank you for attending today, and I hope that you have found this information valuable. Have a good day.